Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajam. Mu'mineen, we are starting today's program, inshallah, with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Brother Raza. Wa ala buland salawat.
I'll be starting from the first juz. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون. إن الذين كفروا سواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. ختم الله على قلوبهم وعلى سمعهم وعلى أبصارهم غشاوة ولهم عذاب عظيم. ومن الناس من يقول آمنا بالله وباليوم الآخر وما هم بمؤمنين يخادعون الله والذين آمنوا وما يخدعون إلا أنفسهم وما يشعرون. في قلوبهم مرض فزادهم الله مرضا ولهم عذاب عليم بما كانوا يكذبون. وإذا قيل لهم لا تفسدوا في الأرض قالوا إنما نحن مصلحون. على إنهم هم المفسدون ولكن لا يشعرون. وإذا قيل لهم آمنوا كما آمن الناس قالوا أنؤمن كما آمن السفهاء ألا إنهم هم السفهاء ولكن لا يعلمون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Ahsan, brother, Ahsan. Respected Sheikh, elders, and brothers and sisters in faith, Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah, I will be requesting the Sheikh to ascend the member shortly, but before that, some housekeeping. Inshallah, we are expecting a lot of Mu'mineen, so please, if I can request you to please move forward. Let us please maximize the space usage so that everybody can get a chance to sit comfortably. I would now like to request the Sheikh to please ascend to the member. Bar Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad salawat. And I would like to request the sisters to do the same, please. Thank you. Bar Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala.
Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وإذ قال عيسى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعد اسمه أحمد فلما جاءهم بالبينات قالوا هذا سحر مبين صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajah. Yesterday we began talking about the life of our beloved Prophet. We mentioned amongst the reasons that are important for us to study the seerah and the life of our beloved Prophet. There were two reasons in particular that we highlighted. Number one, the first reason was because everything that the Prophet does, he does by the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hence, the better one understands the life of the Prophet, the better one understands his lifestyle, the better and deeper his understanding will be with regards to the religion of Islam. Everything that he does by command and by revelation. This is why verses from Surah An-Najm said, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. He doesn't say anything except and only if the Quran is telling him or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding him to do so. And the second reason why studying the seerah is important that we mentioned yesterday is because the more you get to know who this man is, the more you get to spend time with him, the more you get to interact with him and his lifestyle, the more you fall in love with him, and the more affection you build in your heart towards this man. And as we mentioned, inshallah, every step of the way that we move forward with the different chapters of the life of the Prophet, hopefully that love and affection will build even deeper in our hearts as well. Having said that though, the problem with history is that not everything that is said in history about this Prophet of ours is necessarily true. Historians might say things, at the same time we need principles. We need to have filters through which and by which we sift through historical narrations to see what is true about this Prophet of ours and what might be incorrect. And yesterday we mentioned a number of different principles that we might use and utilize in order to sift between what is correct and what is incorrect. And we also mentioned some of the stories that are commonly and widely narrated about the Prophet that we, for example, in the Shia school of thought, or even from amongst the Shia school of thought, we might have theological issues with. We might have issues with the person who's narrating this. We might have issues with it because it doesn't match with the verses of the Quran, and so on and so forth. Hence, not every story that is mentioned out there, whether it's juicy or not juicy, whether it comes with many details about the life of the Prophet or it doesn't come with many details about the life of the Prophet, is not something that we can just take at face value. We'll have to sit down and see and examine to see whether this is a part of history that we can rely on or not. And we also delved into the context of the people of that time and the Arab and the different characteristics that they had, the lack of education that they had, the lack of government that they had, the lack of value towards the female and children that they had, and so on and so forth, and as well as some of the good characteristics that they had that the Prophet used and utilized to combat those negative characteristics. This is where we ended our discussion yesterday. Tonight, inshallah, we'll continue with the discussion by posing the following questions. Number one, what were the two main empires that existed during the time of the Prophet's birth? And why was it that these two huge empires, none of them decided to conquer the land of Arabia? Number two, what was the significance of Quraysh amongst all of the other Arab tribes, and what were they known for? Number three, who were the women who took care of the Prophet when he had no one else to look after him? And how did he remember the good that these women had done to him? And how would he address these women later in his life? Number four, out of all of the uncles of the Prophet, why was it that Abu Talib at the end of the day ended up being the one who would take the Prophet into his own household? And number five, and finally, how did the Prophet start his life by not only losing his father, but also his beloved mother at a very young age. Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 5 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We'll begin from here. If you look at the life of the Prophet and the context of Arabia at that time, it's not like the Arab who didn't have an empire for themselves and didn't have a civilization for themselves. It's not like nobody else had an empire. No, they had empires. This was at a time where the Persian Empire was there, the Roman Empire was there, and this was pretty much the world at that time. A lot of the places where we live weren't even discovered at that time, weren't even a thing yet. This was the world, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire. There was also an empire in Africa at that time, but this was it. The Roman Empire had this long history, extremely powerful. The Roman Empire, of course, or in particular the Byzantine Empire, which is somewhat of an offshoot of the original Roman Empire. These were empires that had existed for hundreds, thousands of years. They were fully established. They had their own civilizations. They had their own kings. The Romans had their Caesars. The Persians had their Khusros. They had kings. They used to, and these two empires were in constant combat with one another. For 200, 300 years, they had wars with one another, going back and forth, because if you are superpower, you're trying to take away from the other superpower. The Prophet and his life and his people are living within this context. But interestingly enough, for some reason, these two major empires in the world, none of them ever think to themselves to conquer this land of Arabia. You look at the Persian Empire, tens of countries were part of the Persian Empire. You look at the Byzantine Empire, same thing. But none of them even bothered to think about this Arabian Peninsula. Why? Because it had such severe lack of natural resources. It was such a difficult place to live, people didn't even care about it. And of course, from the perspective of an empire, it's a land that has no value. From the perspective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala paving the way for the Prophet to come into the picture and now have his own place and his own government. Imagine how things would have been different if the Prophet wanted to begin his message but under the Persian Empire or under the Roman Empire, versus now where the land is free. Yes, there are a number of tribes. There's a bunch of tribes there. Yes? But there's no unified government that is ruling over this land. Would the Prophet had even lived if there was one unifying government that didn't want him to live? You never know. This is a different story altogether. But none of them even bothered to conquer this area. Why? They said, even if we conquer this place, what does it have to offer? This Arabian Peninsula, it doesn't have much to offer anyways. How many cities are there in this Arabian Peninsula? Not many. The big ones are Mecca, Medina, Ta'if. That's pretty much what you have. There's a bunch of smaller ones. You can call them almost villages. It's Mecca, Medina, Ta'if. That's it. Hours and hours you have to walk in the middle of the desert. What benefit does it have? And it was in this context that the Arab lived in the Arabian Peninsula. And the Arab themselves were of two different categories. Some of them had been living in this peninsula from very long time ago. Some of them had migrated to the land of Arabia. They were called the Arab Qahtani. This was the Arab that was living in Arabia from before. There was Arab Adnani, those who migrated. And the family of our prophets came from Arab Adnani. Why? Because our prophet was the descendant of Ismail, who was the descendant of, or the child of, Ibrahim. Ibrahim was not native to the Arabian Peninsula. What happened to Ibrahim? In the story of Ibrahim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him to take who? To take his wife and his son and bring them to the land of Arabia. Yes? When nothing else was there. Hence the Prophet's lineage goes back to those Arab who migrated to the land of Arabia. And people have discussions about these two the tribes or these two categories of Arab. That's not something that we want to go deep into. In this context is where the Prophet is going to be born, and in this context is where his lineage is going to be known. We know that the Prophet is coming from the tribe of Quraysh. This tribe of Quraysh itself had a number of sub-tribes. There's Bani Umayyah, there's Bani Hashim, Bani Makhzum, Bani Abdiddar, Bani Zuhra, so on and so forth. Some have counted to 25, maybe even more, sub-tribes of Quraysh. Out of all of them, 3 or 4 of them were the most important. Bani Umayyah, Bani Hashim, Bani Makhzum. The head of Bani Umayyah was who? This was none but Abu Sufyan. The head of Bani Hashim was who? Abdul Muttalib, and afterwards Abu Talib, his son. The head of Bani Makhzum was who? None but the famous Abu Jahl. The one who the Prophet later on dubbed and gave him the name, the Fir'aun of my ummah. This is what he called Abu Jahl. And this is how many problems Abu Jahl created. This is the context in which the Prophet is entering into his life. His father, Abdullah, was of course someone who was involved in business trips. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses Amina with the Prophet, and she is now pregnant with the Prophet. But when the time of the birth comes, as the days are coming closer and closer, and the mothers know how anxious and worrisome these days are when you come closer and closer, as the days come closer, Amina is waiting for her husband to return back from the trip, from this business trip that he's on. But as she's waiting, and as she is waiting, when the caravan comes back, that had stopped in Medina, has now come back to Mecca, she asks around, she says, where's Abdullah? Say, well, Abdullah got sick, and he was not able to come with us back to Mecca. You can imagine what a mother starts to go through in these moments. So Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of the Prophet, sends another one of his sons to go and check in Medina and see what's happening with Abdullah. They go, and then they come back, and they realize that Abdullah has already passed away. This is how the life of the Prophet now is about to begin. Small side note here, if we're looking at the life of the Prophet just from a materialistic perspective, we would consider this life from the very beginning to be a very unlucky life. Because it didn't just end there with the father, then the mother, then the grandfather. Before the Prophet is even 10 years old, he's already lost 3 different guardians of his. If you and I were to look at a person like this from a materialistic perspective, we say this life, it's already unlucky. Doesn't look too blessed to us. But yet it's the most blessed life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ever granted to everybody. And this goes to show that just because something doesn't start out the way you think it's going to start out, doesn't mean it's not going to end the way you want it to end. Maybe the end is 10 times better than the beginning. The beginning of the life of the Prophet does not look good at all. From any angle you look at it, it does not look good. Abdullah has already passed away. The father of the Prophet has already passed away. He doesn't even get to see, based on the mainstream opinion, he doesn't even get to see his father. Now Amina, of course, is going to give birth to the Prophet. Those days come, Amina gives birth to the Prophet, and there are narrations that speak about Amina seeing certain things from her child. This is a child in the womb, and a child that has now left the womb. Certain incidents are mentioned in history. Nonetheless, she sends word to Abdul Muttalib and tells Abdul Muttalib for him to come, to take this child, to embrace this child, and to later on choose a name for this child. Abdul Muttalib, as we said, was the head of Quraysh. Quraysh, of course, was known for a number of things, and this is why they were so noble. And this is why Abdul Muttalib's role was so important. They were known very well because of them being the ones who were in charge of the Kaaba. This was the family who used to take care of the Kaaba. They were a family who were the descendants of Ibrahim and Ismail. This also had its own value. And as we mentioned, they had these trips that they used to go back and forth on. And these trips and the fact that they were around the Kaaba, this is how they used to provide for themselves. And this is why in the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, listen, if there's anyone who's supposed to oppose the Prophet, if there's anyone who is going to object to the message of the Prophet, it wasn't supposed to be you guys. Quraysh was not supposed to be the one who was going to oppose the Prophet. Why? Because the Quran says, لِإِلَافِ قُرَيْشِ إِلَافِهِمْ رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ. Quraysh needs to worship the Lord of this house. Why? الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُم مِّن جُوعٍ وَآمَنَهُم مِّن خَوْفٍ. It's because of this house and its Lord that you guys are able to provide for yourselves and have security. If it wasn't for this house, if it wasn't for the Kaaba, if anyone was supposed to oppose the Prophet, it wasn't supposed to be you guys. You're the ones who are eating from the fruits of the Lord of this house. Anyone else, it would have made sense, not you guys. Abdul Muttalib comes and takes this child. And the narration says that from the very beginning, Abdul Muttalib had this special connection with the Prophet. Grandchildren, always special. But Abdul Muttalib had other grandchildren, that's the point. He had other grandchildren, but when it came to Muhammad, his relationship was just different. And he used to tell his own sons, he used to say, you know, out of these grandchildren, when I embrace them, when I kiss them, Muhammad has this scent that none of the other ones have. So he takes this child, enters into the Kaaba, and he prays to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessings for this child. A number of days pass by. By the 7th day, they tell Abdul Muttalib, Abdul Muttalib, you have to now choose a name for your son. If we can recite a salawat and both sides please move forward. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد One more salawat, please. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه. They tell Abdul Muttalib, now's the time for you to choose the name. Now, from the perspective of a grandfather, this might seem like it's just a coincidence. You know, you just choose a name. How do we choose names? Maybe you think about it. You know, sometimes people open the Quran, whatever. You know, it's different ways, you know. From our perspective, this might look just like a coincidence. But in reality, you have to ask yourself, is this really a coincidence? So they told Abdul Muttalib 7 days after the Prophet was born, you have to now choose a name for this child. And from what we understand from history, the name the mother chose for her son and the name that the grandfather chose for her son were two different names, though they came from the same root word. The name the mother chose for her son was none but Ahmad. The name that Abdul Muttalib chose was none but Muhammad. Salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Abdul Muttalib chose this name. This was not a name that was common. People asked Abdul Muttalib, they said, why are you choosing this name for him? He said, I want my son. And by the way, Abdul Muttalib always used to refer to the Prophet as my son, not my grandson. My son. He had other grandchildren. This one was different. This one was special. He said, I want my son to be one that is known to be praiseworthy. Okay. Ahmad, same root word. You and I look at this and say, well, it's not a big deal. A grandfather just choosing a name for his grandson. A mother is just choosing a name for her son. No, in reality, maybe Amina doesn't know and maybe Abdul Muttalib doesn't know. They're choosing names that have been promised 600 years ago. 600 years ago, the previous prophet has said that when the next prophet comes, his name will be Ahmad. His name will be the praiseworthy one. Abdul Muttalib doesn't know, Amina doesn't know. They think they're just choosing a name. But this is the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This name that they chose, they had no idea. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already promised this name 600 something years ago. When Isa alayhi salam was walking amongst his companions and amongst Bani Israel, وَإِذْ قَالَ عِيسَى لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ إِنِّي رَسُولُ اللَّهِ إِلَيْكُمْ I am the messenger of God to you. مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيَّ مِنَ التَّوْرَةِ I have come to affirm the Torah, the book of Musa alayhi salam. وَمُبَشِّرًا I give you the good news. How many years ago? 600 something years ago. وَمُبَشِّرًا بِرَسُولٍ There's going to come a messenger. يَأْتِي مِن بَعْدِ اسْمُهُ أَحْمَدٍ There's a prophet who will come. His name is Ahmad. Abdul Muttalib is sitting there and saying, I think I like this name. He doesn't know. This name is already promised to these people. And when we discuss and talk about Medina, you will see this even more. Because one of the reasons why Medina became that place where Islam spread was because it had a Jewish presence. And the reason why that is important is because they were waiting for this prophet to come. And the Quran makes a claim that historically might be difficult for us to prove today. I'm just putting that disclaimer out there. It's a point. Historically, it's difficult to prove for us today. But the Quran says it and we believe in it. The Quran says these people, they knew the signs of the prophet that was going to come so well. They knew him better than they knew they knew him, they knew the prophet better than they knew their own children. يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. This is the people of Ahlul Kitab knew him better than they knew their own children. Abdul Muttalib and Amina have no idea. They're just choosing names. But this is all part of the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How many things have to go right for this prophet to then come here and spread his message? These empires have to not have much to do with this land. And they have to choose names that are exactly the names that have been promised 600 years ago. And this is where the relationship between Abdul Muttalib and the prophet began. And the narrations tell us that every step of the way Abdul Muttalib showed even more kindness and compassion towards Muhammad. Why? Because Abdul Muttalib was the head of Quraysh at that time. And he had his own place near the Kaaba. And this was a very common thing that Quraysh used to do. You know how we go to work and then in the evening you come back, you sit down, maybe you have a cup of tea, whatever, coffee, whatever it is, right? You relax a little bit. They used to come and sit around the Kaaba to relax. So Abdul Muttalib had this place around the Kaaba where he would sit. No one else was able to sit on that area, in that, where they had that blanket or whatever they had put down for him. The others would sit around him, but not there. And the children would come and go. And amongst those children was our prophet. He used to come and go. And sometimes he would come and sit by his grandfather on this area that they provided for him. And the other uncles of the prophet, they used to tell him, no, you can't do that. You have to come sit down here. You can't sit up there. That's Abdul Muttalib's place. And Abdul Muttalib used to say, don't bother my son. And he used to take the prophet, he used to embrace him and kiss him. And he used to say, there's a scent from Muhammad that I have not felt from anybody else. Him, he can come here and stay with me. This child is born. The moment he is born, initially, Thawbiya, this maid of Abu Lahab, starts to nurse this child for a number of days. Hold on to this name, Thawbiya. We're going to come back to it at the end of the talk tonight. Thawbiya nurses the prophet for a number of days. When he reaches a certain age, still an infant, when he reaches a certain age, then there was a custom amongst the Arab that they used to send their children out to the outskirts of Mecca to be raised there. Why? You grow up healthier. You grow up stronger. Yes? You're not as pampered as you are living inside of the city. So they used to have this custom where the women who were nursing their own children used to come into Mecca. They used to choose children. They used to go back. And from this, they had some sort of income as well, because the family who was giving the child away would then be providing some sort of, income for this fact that they are raising this child. This prophet of ours is in Mecca. The women are coming now. Amongst those women, this lady known by the name of Halima Sa'adiyya. She was from the tribe of Bani Sa'ad. Halima Sa'adiyya is coming as well. But it's such an interesting story how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala linked the prophet with Halima. Because it didn't even go the way you would think it went. What happened? Halima Sa'adiyya is coming. But Halima Sa'adiyya is extremely late. Why? Because she has a camel that's old. They couldn't even ride the camel as they were coming to Mecca. And this camel couldn't give milk anymore either. And it was like, by the end of its life. So she comes with her own son that she is nursing, that she was even struggling to nurse. And her husband, they come into Mecca. And by the time they get to Mecca, everyone has taken the good babies. The well-established families, the families that are wealthy, Bani Hashim was not known for their wealth. They're all taken. The ones that are left are some of them different. This is the mainstream opinion I'm sharing, of course. The ones that are left, some are there. And of course, Muhammad, but he's yatim. He's an orphan. He doesn't even have a father. So Halima comes, and the narration says that when she came, she looked around and she saw nobody else. And at one point she turned to her husband and she said, you know what, if we walk away without a child, I feel embarrassed that we came all of this way and we're walking away empty-handed. So we'll take this one. And her husband said, it's okay, let's take this one. Hopefully he will bring some benefit for us. You see how life works? So we'll take this one. Hopefully he'll have some benefit for us. You know who else said this? The one who took Yusuf into his house. Yes? وَقَالَ الَّذِي اشْتَرَاهُ مِن مِصْرَ لِامْرَأَتِهِ أَكْرِمِي مَثْوَاهُ. Take care of him. عَسَىٰ أَن يَنْفَعَنَا. Hopefully you have some benefit for us. He became the most important person in all of the lands. Halima takes Muhammad with her. And she narrates that when I took Muhammad with me, slowly, not only was I able to nurse Muhammad, not only was I able to nurse my own child, now even our cattle and our camels, they had the milk. The life had changed now. All of a sudden, this baby is bringing blessings into our life that we had never expected. And Halima takes care of the Prophet for 5 years. This is while his mother is still alive in the city of Mecca. And the narrations tell us that every now and then they would bring the Prophet back to his mother. And Halima wanted to return the Prophet, and Halima and the mother would say, no, take him back a little bit more. And this happened on a number of occasions, partially because narrations tell us Halima understood how special he was. She was so worried about him. I don't want to be the one who's protecting him because something happens to him. Bring him back to his mother. And his mother kept telling Halima, no, there's something about him. I know he will never be hurt. I know people will not be able to carry out their evil intentions with regards to him. And narrations tell us some of the snippets of the life of the Prophet. They say one day when Halima was sending the children out, she had children of her own, yes, and other children maybe she was taking care of. When they were sending the children out to go and play in the desert, she started to prepare the Prophet as well. The Prophet had told her that I want to go and play as well. And when she was preparing him, she said, okay, now for your protection, I'm going to put this necklace on you. And this necklace had either a bone or a stone or a rock connected to it. And this was their superstitious belief that this was going to take care of you. Maybe the Prophet is 4, 5, 3. We don't know exactly how old he is at this point. But the narration says that he turned to Halima and he said, my mother. Hold on to this point. We're going to come back to this point. The Prophet used to refer to Halima as his mother. It's not his mother. He used to refer to Halima as his mother. He said, mother, these are not the things that protect human beings. If there's going to be someone who's going to protect me, it's going to be someone else. These things are not going to protect us. These are snippets into the life of the Prophet. This continues until the Prophet reaches the age of 5, 6. Then Amina wants to take her son back to visit the grave of his father in Yathrib or in Medina. So Amina comes and takes her son with her to Medina, and on the way back, Amina now passes away in an area called the area of Abwa, outside of Medina. How old is the Prophet at this point? 6 years of age. Does it look like this blessed life, like you're going to change the world? No, it doesn't look like that at all right now, does it? You've lost your father, you lost your mother as well. Now he is granted to Abdul Muttalib. And Abdul Muttalib now starts to take care of his son, as he used to refer to him. But this was only the beginning of the difficulties that would come the way of the Prophet. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Abdul Muttalib starts to take care of this little son of his. This continues until the age of 8, roughly. By the age of 8, now Abdul Muttalib is getting old, and he is now has fallen ill, and he is leaving this world as well. On his deathbed, he turned to his sons and he said, Abu Talib, I need you to take care of Muhammad. He is going to have a great future and a great fate ahead of him. This one is going to be special. I need you to take care of him. And Abu Talib accepted this responsibility from the Prophet. Partially because Abu Talib and Abdullah, the father of the Prophet, were brothers from both mother and father. They had a deeper connection compared to the other uncles of the Prophet. You know, the other uncles of the Prophet, Abu Lahab was also the uncle of the Prophet, but from one side. Abu Talib was the uncle of the Prophet from both sides. And Abu Talib, based on this narration, Abdul Muttalib took the hand of Abu Talib, took the hand of the Prophet, put their hands into one another. And he said, I wish I would live to the point where I would be able to protect him. But now that I cannot, Abu Talib, I'm leaving everything in your hands. You are the one who has to take care of him. Abu Talib accepted, and Abdul Muttalib said, now I can leave this world in peace. And Abdul Muttalib now closes his eyes. This is the third guardian of the Prophet, who's now already left this world. This life, you and I, if we're the judge, this doesn't look like a blessed life at all. This looks like forgive me, from a materialistic perspective, it looks like a horrible life. Like everyone you get connected to, they end up leaving this world. It's extremely difficult. But that's the way we look at things. We don't see the full picture. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees the full picture. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what lies ahead of this young little boy who's not even 10 at this age. Abdul Muttalib also leaves this world. Now the guardianship of the Prophet is placed on Abu Talib. And the role that Abu Talib played for the Prophet was a role that you and I will never be able to fully understand. What Abu Talib did for the Prophet, nobody else did for the Prophet. Nobody. And we'll talk about the faith of Abu Talib, because right here, I don't want to go into this discussion too much, just a little sneak peek into the discussion. Right here, you will find a very clear line between the two schools of thought within Islam. Where in the Sunni school of thought, Abu Talib is seen as someone who never embraced the faith of the Prophet. And in the Shia school of thought, there is unanimous opinion and consensus that he did in fact embrace the faith of the Prophet. And sometimes what you hear is said about Abu Talib, it breaks your heart. But these are polemic discussions, and every school of thought has to look at it from their own perspective, and so on and so forth. But the role that Abu Talib played for the Prophet, because the narration says, from the time Abdul Muttalib passed away, Abu Talib did not even leave the Prophet alone. Everywhere he would go with him. And as we'll discuss, when they went to the boycott and they were in the valley of Abu Talib, in Shi'b Abu Talib, he would sleep with the Prophet every night because he was so worried about the life of the Prophets. What if they try to come and assassinate him? What if they try to come and kill him? And Abu Talib used to put his own children in the place of the Prophets, so that if someone were to come and assassinate him, they would end up killing his own children instead of the Prophet. The children of Abu Talib did not sleep in the place of the Prophet once. They slept in the place of the Prophet multiple times. One of them, and the most notable, was the night of Hijrah, we'll discuss. Even before that, this is who Abu Talib was for the Prophet. But there's also the role of another person in the midst of all of this who sometimes goes unmentioned, and that is the wife of Abu Talib. This is who? This is the mother of Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. This is the wife, the mother of our beloved Imam. And what you find is that all of these women who took care of the Prophet always remembered what they had done for him. Whether it was Thawbiyah, the narration says he used to send her gifts. Whether it was Ayman later on in his life, whether it was Halima, whether it was Fatima bint Asad, the wife of Abu Talib, he always used to honor them because they took care of me when I had nobody around me. And interestingly enough, to all three of these women, Ayman, Fatima bint Asad, and Halima Sa'adiyah, narrations say the Prophet used to refer to them as my mother. But they're not your mother. Doesn't matter. They did things for me that my mother would have done for me. And in particular, his relationship with Fatima bint Asad was very special. And where do you see this relationship really showing itself and manifesting itself the most? When those moments came, when Ali ibn Abi Talib came to the Prophet and said, Ya Rasulullah, my mother has passed away. This is after the Hijrah. Now, just fast forward, after Mecca, they've moved on to Medina, 4th year after Hijrah. The Prophet saw Ali ibn Abi Talib one day. This is narrated in Amali of Shaykh al-Saduq. Saw Ali ibn Abi Talib one day. He was crying. And the Prophet asked him, said, Ya Ali, why are you crying? And Ali said, I'm crying because I lost my mother today. Take a look at what the Prophet did. This is not even his quote-unquote real mother. It's not the one who gave birth to him, but it is the one who did good on him. The Prophet told Ali, Ya Ali, the narration says Ali was crying. The narration says the Prophet started to cry himself. And he said, Rahimallahu ummak. May Allah have mercy on your mother, Ya Ali. In kanat laka umman, if your mother was like a mother to you, if she did her motherly duties towards you, kana li umman. She was like a mother to me too. But it's not your mother. She did the work of a mother for me. Prophet will never forget the good that others have done to him. And then the narration says, the Prophet himself said, Ya Ali, go and tell them that this is my ammama. And this is my clothing. Tell them to use this as the kafan of Fatima bint Asad. And tell them to do a good job with the ghusl and the kafan, because when that part is done, I am going to come myself to take care of the affairs of Fatima bint Asad. And the narration, they says they did the ghusl and the kafan, and then the Prophet himself came to do the salat. And the narration says the Prophet did a salat for Fatima bint Asad that he had never done the like of for anybody before. Is this Fatima? Did she fight in some battle? No. The Prophet will explain why this woman had this status. He's never going to forget the good that this woman did for her. Did the salat, and before the salat, he recited takbir 40 times. Then they put the grave, he went inside of the grave himself. And he took the body and they put the grave. And then the narration says, in those moments, and you can imagine what the heart of the Prophet is going through. You can imagine what the heart of Ali ibn Abi Talib is going through in these moments. The narration says, ثُمَّ الزَّحَفَ عِنْدَ رَأْسِهَا. Then he came closer to the head of Fatima bint Asad. And now the Prophet himself is going to do the talqeen of Fatima bint Asad himself. I'm going to do it. And he started to say, Oh Fatima, when they ask you, respond like this. And when they ask you, respond like this. And when they ask you who your master is and who your imam is, who your leader is, tell them ibni, tell them my son is my leader. So I'm your son and you're my mother. The narration says that he then got out of the grave. And he walked away. Ammar then later asked him, he said, Ya Rasulullah, why? Why like this? Why a salat that you had never done the like of it before for anybody else? Why the 40 takbir? He said, Ammar, you have no idea who Fatima bint Asad was. Fatima bint Asad was the one who, when I as an orphan was brought into the house, she used to feed me, the orphan, before she used to feed her own children. And she used to clothe me before she used to clothe her own children. And she used to bathe me before she used to bathe her own children. There were times her own children might have even gone hungry, but she used to make sure that I, as the orphan in the household, that I am fed well. And then he told Ammar, he said, Ammar, the reason why I recited 40 takbir, because I looked to my left and I looked to my right and I saw 40 lines of malaika. And for every one of them, I recited a separate takbir. This is the Prophet's seerah, that if someone does good to you, you are to never forget that good. How many of these women did the Prophet refer to as my mother? They're like my mother. But Ya Rasulullah, you only have one mother. No, they did the work of a mother for me. I will never forget the good that they have done for me. This is the lesson that we learn. And of course, a woman like this, who feeds the orphan before she feeds her own children, Of course, a woman like this has the status of having her own child born in the Kaaba. No doubt. If you and I did things like this as well, this is how you gain the status. You don't gain the status because you're related to the Prophet. You gain the status because you feed the orphan before you feed your own child. These are the lessons that we learn from the life of our beloved Prophet. With that, inshallah, we'll end tonight's talk. Tomorrow, inshallah, or not tomorrow, Thursday, inshallah, we'll continue with the topic and we'll get into the youth and then afterwards the marriage of the Prophet as well. Before I end, inshallah, let us take a moment to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of tonight's program, as well as the sponsors from the St. Louis community, with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa Ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد أشهد أن علي ولي الله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد أشهد أن حجة الله اللهم صل على محمد حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله صل على محمد وآل محمد.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله اللهم صل على محمد. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا علي يا عظيم يا غفور يا رحيم. أنت الرب العظيم الذي ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. وهذا شهر عظمته وكرمته وشرفته وفضلته على الشهور، وهو الشهر الذي فرضت صيامه عليه، وهو شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان، وجعلت فيه ليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر. فيا ذا المن ولا يمن عليك، منا علي بفكاك رقبتي من النار فيمن تمن عليه، وأدخلني الجنة برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله ما صل على محمد وعلى محمد أشهد أن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله أكبر اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية اللهم عجل وليك الفرج اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم أدخل على أهل القبور السرور. اللهم أغن كل فقير. اللهم أشبع كل جائع. اللهم اكس كل عريان. اللهم اغذك دين كل مدين. اللهم فرج عن كل مكروب. اللهم رد كل غريب. اللهم فك كل أسير. اللهم أصلح كل فاسد من أمور المسلمين. اللهم اشف كل مريض. اللهم سد فقرنا بغناك. اللهم غير سوء حالنا بحسن حالك. اللهم اقض عنا الدين وأغننا من الفقر، إنك على كل شيء قدير. صلوات والسلام على محمد وعلى محمد. Inshallah, we'll do ziyarat after dua al-iftitah.
Inshallah, we'll be starting Dua Iftitah in the next 5 minutes. Bar Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.
Inshallah, we're going to begin with recitation of Dua al-Iftitah. Please recite it loud. Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajah. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم إني أفتتح الثناء بحمدك وأنت مصدد للصواب بمنك وأيقنت أنك أنت أرحم الراحمين في موضع العفو والرحمة وأشد المعاقبين في موضع النكال والنقمة وأعظم المتجبرين في موضع الكبرياء والعظمة اللهم أذنت لي في دعائك ومسألتك فاسمع يا سميع مدحتي وأجب يا رحيم دعوتي وأقل يا غفور عثرتي فكم يا إلهي من كربة قد فرجتها وهموم قد كشفتها وعثرة قد أقلتها ورحمة قد نشرتها وحلقة بلاء قد فككتها الحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك ولم يكن له ولي من الذل وكبره تكبيرا اللهم صل على محمد الحمد لله بجميع محامده كلها على جميع نعمه كلها الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته الحمد لله الفاشي في الخلق أمره وحمده الظاهر بالكرم مجده الباسط بالجود يده الذي لا تنقص خزائنه ولا تزيده كثرة العطاء إلا جودا وكرما إنه هو العزيز الوهاب اللهم إني أسألك قليلا من كثير ما حاجة بي إليه عظيمة وغناك عنه قديم وهو عندي كثير وهو عليك سهل يسير اللهم إن عفوك عن ذنبي وتجاوزك عن خطيئتي وصفحك عن ظلمي وسترك على قبيح عملي وحلمك عن كثير جرمي عندما كان من خطئي وعمدي أتمعني في أن أسألك ما لا أستوجبه منك الذي رزقتني من رحمتك وأريتني من قدرتك وأرفتني من إجابتك فصرت أدعوك آمنا وأسألك مستأنسا لا خائفا ولا وجلا مدلا عليك فيما قصدت فيه إليك فإن أبتى عني عتبت بجهلي عليك ولعل الذي أبتى عني هو خير لي لعلمك بعاقبة الأمور فلم أر مولا كريما أصبر على عبد لئيم منك عليه يا رب إنك تدعوني فأولي عنك، وتتحبب إلي وأتبغض إليك، وتتودد إلي فلا أقبل منك، كأن لي التطول عليك. فلم يمنعك ذلك من الرحمة لي والإحسان إلي والتفضل علي بجودك وكرمك، فارحم عبدك الجاهل وجد عليه بفضل إحسانك، إنك جواد كريم. الحمد لله مالك الملك مجري الفلك مسخر الرياح فانق الإصباح ديان الدين رب العالمين. الحمد لله على حلمه بعد علمه، والحمد لله على عفوه بعد قدرته، والحمد لله على طول أناته في غضبه، وهو قادر على ما يريد. الحمد لله خالق الخلق باسط الرزق فالق الإصباح ذي الجلال والإكرام والفضل والإنعام، الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى تبارك وتعالى. الحمد لله الذي ليس له منازع يعادله، ولا شبيه يشاكله، ولا ظهير يعاضده، قهر بعزته الأعزاء وتواضع لعظمته العظماء، فبلغ بقدرته ما يشاء. الحمد لله الذي يجيبني حين أناديه ويستر علي كل عورة وأنا أعصيه، ويعظم النعمة علي فلا أجازيه. فكم من موهبة هنيئة قد أعطاني، وعظيمة مخوفة قد كفاني، وبهجة مونقة قد أراني، فأثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا. الحمد لله الذي لا يهتك حجابه ولا يغلق بابه ولا يرد سائله ولا يخيب آمله. الحمد لله الذي يؤمن الخائفين وينجي الصالحين ويرفع المستضعفين ويدع المستكبرين ويهلك ملوكا ويستخلف آخرين. والحمد لله قاصم الجبارين مبير الظالمين مدرك الهاربين نكال الظالمين صريخ المستصرخين موضع حاجات الطالبين معتمد المؤمنين. الحمد لله الذي من خشيته ترعد السماء وسكانها وترجف الأرض وعمارها وتموج البحار ومن يسبح في غمراتها. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي يخلق ولم يخلق ويرزق ولا يرزق ويطعم ولا يطعم ويميت الأحياء ويحيي الموتى وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وأمينك وصفيك وحبيبك وخيرتك من خلقك وحافظ سرك ومبلغ رسالاتك، أفضل وأحسنها وأجمل وأكمل وأزكى وأنمى وأتيب وأتهر وأسنى، وأكثر ما صليت وباركت وترحمت وتحننت وسلمت على أحد من عبادك وأنبيائك ورسلك وصفتك وأهل الكرامة عليك من خلقك. اللهم وصل على علي أمير المؤمنين ووصي رسول رب العالمين، عبدك ووليك وأخيه رسولك وحجتك على خلقك وآيتك الكبرى والنبأ العظيم. وصل على الصديقة الطاهرة فاطمة سيدة نساء العالمين، وصل على سبطي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة، وصل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي، حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة. اللهم وصل على ولي أمرك القائم المؤمل والعدل المنتظر وحفه بملائكتك المقربين وأيده بروح القدس يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعله الداعي إلى كتابك والقائم بدينك، استخلفه في الأرض كما استخلفت الذين من قبله، مكن له دينه الذي ارتضيته له، أبدله من بعد خوفه أمنا، يعبدك لا يشرك بك شيئا. اللهم أعزه وأعزز به، وانصره وانتصر به، وانصره نصرا عزيزا، وافتح له فتحا يسيرا، واجعل له من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا. اللهم أظهر به دينك وسنة نبيك حتى لا يستخفي بشيء من الحق مخافة أحد من الخلق. اللهم إنا نرغب إليك في دولة كريمة تعز بها الإسلام وأهله، وتذل بها النفاق وأهله، وتجعلنا فيها من الدعاة إلى طاعتك والقادة إلى سبيلك، وترزقنا بها كرامة الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم ما عرفتنا من الحق فحملناه، وما قصرنا عنه فبلغناه. اللهم المم به شعثنا، واشعب به صدعنا، وارتق به فتقنا، وكثر به قلتنا، وأعزز به ذلتنا، وأغن به عائلنا، واغض به عن مغرمنا، واجبر به فقرنا، وسد به خلتنا، ويسر به عسرنا، وبيض به وجوهنا، وفك به أسرنا، وأنجح به طلبتنا، وأنجز به مواعيدنا، واستجب به دعوتنا، وأعتنا به سؤلنا، وبلغنا به من الدنيا والآخرة آمالنا. وأعتنا به فوق رغبتنا يا خير المسؤولين وأوسع المعطين. اشف به صدورنا وأذهب به غيظ قلوبنا، واهدنا لما اختلف فيه من الحق بإذنك، إنك تهدي من تشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. وانصرنا به على عدوك وعدونا إله الحق آمين. اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله، وغيبة ولينا، وكثرة عدونا، وقلة عددنا، وشدة الفتن بنا، وتظاهر الزمان علينا. فصل على محمد وآله، وأعنا على ذلك بفتح منك تعجل، وبضر تكشف، ونصر تعز، وسلطان حق تظهره، ورحمة منك تجللناها، وعافية منك تلبسناها، برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. زيارة. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين، السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين، السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان، ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا، ورحمة الله وبركاته.